and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Glenn Miller, his biography and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. To start off with, the Glenn Miller Masterpieces Volume 2 released in 1947. This one dropped after Miller's passing, but it hit number 1 on the Billboard charts for 6 weeks. A perfect collection that reminded the world just how powerful and elegant his sound was. Critics and fans alike hailed it as one of the gold standards of swing nostalgia. Fast forward 1954 and Hollywood gives us the Glenn Miller story. The soundtrack album, Glenn Miller Plays selections from the film, not only captured Miller's most iconic tracks but soared to the top of the charts, earning a gold certification. It gave a whole new generation a taste of that unmistakable Miller sound. Now, if you wanted to feel the electricity of Glenn Miller live, 1958 brought us the Glenn Miller Carnegie Hall concert. Pure energy, tight arrangements, and an audience buzzing with excitement. This album bottled the atmosphere of a legendary night. And finally, for the vinyl collectors out there, 1975's Pure Gold. RCA Record put together Miller's greatest hits in one package, keeping his music fresh for both longtime fans and newcomers discovering swing for the very first time. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Glenn Miller, his biography and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. First up, the year was 1947. Swing music was still the soundtrack of a nation. RCA Victor Records released Glenn Miller Masterpieces Volume 2. Now keep in mind, Miller had been gone for 3 years at this point, and yet the album shot right up the Billboard charts, spending 6 weeks at number 1 between 1947 and 1948. Critics loved it, listeners adored it, and why? Because it wasn't just a collection of songs. It was a carefully curated portrait of Miller's sound. Those tight brass harmonies, the clarinet-led reed section, that signature swing you just couldn't mistake. For many Americans, this album wasn't just nostalgia, it was proof that Glenn Miller's orchestra still defined the gold standard of big band music. Now fast forward to 1954. Hollywood decided to tell Miller's story on the big screen in The Glenn Miller Story, starring none other than James Stewart as Miller himself. The film was a smash hit, but so was the music that came with it. RCA rolled out the compilation album Glenn Miller Plays selections from the film The Glenn Miller Story. And just like the movie, the record soared. It went number 1 on the Billboard albums charts and even picked up a gold certification from the RIAA. Why did people love it so much? Because it wasn't just a soundtrack, it was a reintroduction. Young audiences who hadn't lived through the swing era suddenly discovered what the fuss was all about. Meanwhile, those who remembered jitterbugging in the dance halls of the 40s, they got to relive it. Listeners praised the album for capturing the spirit of Miller's orchestra with crystal clarity, and critics agreed it was a faithful, glowing tribute. 4 years later, in 1958, another treasure surfaced, the Glenn Miller Carnegie Hall concert. Now, if you've ever been to Carnegie Hall, you know it's not just another venue, it's a shrine. And hearing Miller's orchestra in that space, pure magic. The live album that followed gave fans a chance to feel like they were sitting in those velvet seats, soaking up every note. You could hear the energy of the crowd, the polish of the band, and that unmistakable swing that even made the stiffer scholar loosen up. Critics raved about the album's authenticity. They said it captured not just the notes on paper, but the living, breathing atmosphere of a Glenn Miller performance. And for listeners who never got the chance to see Glenn Miller live, this was the closest thing to being there. And then in 1975, 3 full decades after Miller's passing, RCA struck gold again. Literally. The album released Pure Gold, a compilation that pulled together some of Miller's greatest hits as part of its broader series celebrating popular music legends. This wasn't just an album for collectors or fans dusting off their phonographs. This was a gateway. A whole new generation, teenagers in the 70s who'd grown up on rock and roll, suddenly discovered the smooth swinging sounds of Glenn Miller. Critics praised the selection, saying it gave listeners a perfect snapshot of Miller's career, and audiences agreed, calling it both a tribute to his legacy and a convenient way to experience the magic of that big brass and reed sound. So there you have it, 4 albums spanning nearly 3 decades, all carrying the torch of Glenn Miller's music. From Masterpieces Volume 2 keeping the flame alive in the 40s, to the Glenn Miller Story soundtrack reigniting the fire in the 50s, to the raw electricity of the Carnegie Hall, and finally, Pure Gold reminding the world that in the 70s that swing never really goes out of style. Glenn Miller may have disappeared over the English Channel in 1944, but in truth he never really left. His music kept climbing the charts, filling homes and moving feet. And every time you drop the needle on one of those records or stream a track today, we are reminded why his sound wasn't just popular, it was iconic. And that was some insight into some of Glenn Miller's best albums of all time. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Glenn Miller, his biography and best hits. Now it's time for some trending music news. The New Jersey Performing Arts Center is bringing back the TD Jazz for Teens program for its 28th year. This is the spot for student musicians aged 13 to 18 who want to take their skills to the next level. We are talking world-class training, history, theory, jam sessions, even masterclasses with Grammy winners like Christian McBride, Stephon Harris and Regina Carter. Classes run September through May at Arts High School on MLK Boulevard. And yes, there are scholarships available. Registration's open right now, but the deadline is September 29th. Hit up ngpac.org to lock in your spot. Jazz for Teens, 28 years strong and still shaping the next generation of stars. And that was some trending music news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We're going for a short break, we'll be right back after that. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Glenn Miller, his biography and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Let's start with an album of outstanding arrangements released back in 1950. This compilation shows off Miller's genius for taking familiar tunes and turning them into something completely fresh. Critics raved about the innovative arrangements, and fans couldn't get enough of that signature Miller Orchestra polish. Roll it back just a year earlier to 1954 and you've got Starlight Serenades. Smooth, romantic and dreamy, this album captures the post-war mood perfectly. Audiences are craving a little nostalgia, a little romance, and Miller's group delivered. It's a perfect late-night listen that still holds its glow today. Now, if you want to hear how Glenn Miller became a household name, look no further than the popular recordings 1938 to 1942. This collection takes you straight through his rise, from the earliest hits to the sound that defined an era. With remastered clarity, it's like stepping back in the swing halls of the 1940s. And for the modern fan, the 2005 reissue of The Essential Glenn Miller ties it all together. A powerhouse playlist of iconic hits and hidden gems polished up with crystal clear remastering. It's the ultimate way for new listeners and longtime fans to experience the magic all over again. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Glenn Miller, his biography and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. First up, an album of outstanding arrangements released in 1950. Now, if there's one thing Glenn Miller was known for besides his unforgettable melodies, it was his incredible knack for arranging. He had this uncanny ability to take a tune that everybody already knew and reimagine it in a way that felt brand new. This album is exactly that, an exhibition of Miller's craft. Critics at the time praised the innovation, and fans loved hearing familiar songs transformed with that signature Miller touch. A clarinet soaring above warm trombones, brass blending in like voices in harmony, rhythms precise but never stiff. What makes this album so important is that it reminds us Glenn Miller wasn't just a band leader, he was a master of reinvention. He gave new life to melodies that might have otherwise faded into the background. Listeners often say this album feels like a bridge. It brings nostalgia, yes, but also a sense of novelty. You hear the past and the present mingling together, and it proves why Miller's influence extended far beyond his own lifetime. Now, from Miller the arranger, let's move to Miller the romantic. In 1949, Starlight Serenades hit the shelves. This album is pure atmosphere. Released just 4 years after the end of World War II, it tapped into the emotions of a post-war America, a nation yearning for stability, love, and a touch of nostalgia. The selections on this album showcase Miller's ability to write music that wasn't just for dancing, it was for dreaming. Couples who had been separated by war now found themselves reunited, and Miller's orchestra provided the soundtrack to that reunion. Critics say the album perfectly captured the era's longing for romance and simplicity. Fans still love it today because it has a timeless quality. It's not about flashy solos or fast tempos, it's about mood, about painting a picture of moonlit nights and slow dances. If you want to understand why Glenn Miller's sound is often called smooth and sophisticated, Starlight Serenades is a perfect place to start. But of course, Miller wasn't just a ballad man. To understand the true rise of Glenn Miller, you have to go back to his early years, and that's exactly what the popular recordings 1938 to 1942 does. This compilation is more than an album, it's a history lesson in swing. These were the years when Miller went from being a talented band leader to a household name. The set includes iconic tracks that built his reputation, and does so in chronological order, so you can hear his evolution. From the energetic drive of In the Mood to the elegance of Moonlight Serenade, every track shows another step in his journey. Critics praise this collection for how thoroughly it represented Miller's early years, and listeners especially loved the remastering. Suddenly, those old shellac 78s had new clarity, and you could hear details that might have been lost to time. For fans who want to relive the swing years, or for newcomers who want to experience them for the first time, this album was essential. And that brings us to our final album, The Essential Glenn Miller, released in 2005. Now this one is special because it reminds us that Miller's music wasn't just for his own time. Decades later, in the 21st century, people were still buying his albums, still discovering his orchestra. The reissue was beautifully curated. It pulled together not only his biggest hits, but also some hidden gems. The remastering gave the tracks a clarity that made them feel alive again, as though the band had just stepped into the studio. Critics praised it for its thoughtful balance, giving both longtime fans and new listeners something to enjoy. And the word essential really fits. For most people, this album served as their first introduction to Miller's world. Maybe they heard In the Mood in a movie, maybe they recognized some songs from a commercial, and they picked up the CD out of curiosity. What they found was a complete overview of a master at work. music that was just as vibrant in 2005 as it was in 1940. So, 4 albums, each one shining a light on a different side of Glenn Miller. An album of outstanding arrangements reminds us of his brilliance as an arranger. Starlight Serenades captures the romance of post-war America. The popular recordings 1938 to 1942 takes us through his rise to stardom. And the essential Glenn Miller proves that even into the 21st century, his music still resonates. What ties them all together is that unmistakable sound, the mix of precision and warmth, the melodies that tug at your heart, the rhythms that make your feet want to move. Glenn Miller didn't just lead a group, he created a legacy. And that was some insight into some of Glenn Miller's best albums of all time. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Glenn Miller, his biography and best hits. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now it's time to recap what we were discussing on this program. Born in 1904 in Iowa, Glenn Miller wasn't destined to just play music, he was destined to change it. He picked up a trombone as a boy, worked his way through high school bands, and by the late 1920s he was already playing with some of the biggest names of the jazz age. But Miller wasn't satisfied with being a sideman. He had an idea, a sound that would become his signature, a clarinet playing the melody supported by a saxophone section. That smooth, rich texture is what made the Glenn Miller Orchestra instantly recognizable. By 1938, Miller formed his own band, and within an year they were America's top-selling swing orchestra. From 1939 to 1943, he recorded more top 10 hits than Elvis or the Beatles did in their prime. And the titles still resonate: Moonlight, Serenade, In the Mood, Tuxedo Junction, Pennsylvania 65000. These weren't just hits, they were the heartbeat of pre-war and wartime America. Dance halls, radio shows, jukeboxes, everywhere you turned, you could hear that unmistakable Miller swing. Now let's talk about some of the albums that have carried his legacy throughout the decades. First up, Glenn Miller Masterpieces Volume 2, released in 1947, 3 years after his untimely death. This posthumous compilation shot to #1 on the Billboard albums charts, staying there for 6 weeks. Critics praised its careful curation, saying it distilled the very essence of Miller's sound. Next, we can't forget Glenn Miller plays selections from the film The Glenn Miller Story, released in 1954 alongside the James Stewart biopic. The movie was a smash hit, and so was the record. It topped the charts and earned gold certification. Reviewers admired how faithfully the recordings captured Miller's original sound, full, warm, and instantly nostalgic. For a new generation, this was their first introduction to Miller's music, and it lit the spark all over again. And then in 1958, the Glenn Miller Carnegie Hall concert hit the shelves. Recorded live, it gave listeners the rare thrill of hearing Miller's orchestra as one of America's greatest venues. Critics raved about the album's authenticity, highlighting the energy of the audience and the precision of the band. For anyone who had never had the chance to see Glenn Miller in person, this was the closest you could get. Of course, no conversation about Glenn Miller is complete without the story of his service. At the height of his fame in 1942, he walked away from the spotlight to join the Army Air Force, leading the military band that lifted the spirits of troops overseas. Tragically, in 1944, his plane disappeared over the English Channel. He was just 40 years old. But his music never disappeared. His orchestra continues to tour to this day. Recordings still sell, and Moonlight Serenade remains one of the most enduring ballads of the 20th century. Glenn Miller didn't just give us swing, he gave us a sound that defined an era, a sound that still makes us smile, sway, and remember. And that was some insight into the life and times and best hits of Glenn Miller, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. And on that note, we've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update. Don't forget, you can check out the archives of today's program on my YouTube channel, the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.